Welcome and good afternoon, everyone, or good morning if you're in another time zone. Anyways, it's kind of neat to hear from Lainey earlier this afternoon, as well as all the other presenters, because I think, Scott, you and I are going to try to put this in a nice package, because a lot of things that we've talked about in terms of, what the legal why is, what organizations should be aware of perhaps, or, what can I do, or how to be proactive is ultimately what we're talking about. So Lainey really talked to us about the barriers that are out there. And certainly we've been talking a lot about this as civil rights more than anything else, but more so that this is the right thing to do. Lee, you even chatted about the fact that, the population of individuals out there is huge. I mean, if you think about the number of folks that are disabled, it's greater than the largest minority in the USA. So, I mean, who doesn't want to market to to a minority or to a group of individuals that will benefit? And certainly we've seen that happen in the disability rights struggle. This was a Section 504 struggle in terms of funding. We've seen, much like Lainey had, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And of course, in Canada, we've seen a lot of movement as far as the Canada Accessible Act is concerned. But what's really driving this stuff, and really why do I really need to consider avoiding litigation? So we're going to talk a lot about that infrastructure. And really, the landscape says the following. There's a pile of demand letters that are going out every day. And I think Lainey discussed the fact that there are a lot of lawyers that are doing this, unfortunately. It's nice to have upstanding lawyers and advocates like Lainey out there, but certainly we see on an ongoing basis are these lawsuits, or what we're calling legal extortion. The state of Florida is a great example of that, where people are making careers of just litigating and settlements. In throughout the state of Florida, for all the counties, cities, and towns, there's been well over 200 settlements that have occurred out there that were being pushed by Joel Price and Juan Gill. And as a result, a lot of organizations were just not ready for some of these regulations. And of course, I won't go through the regulations because this is all going to be here. Here's a pile of US-based ones. Each have very specific details, but they all percolate up to the Americans with Disabilities Act. And certainly working with the US government, you have to be sure that you have the right documents, the right content when you're working as one of their suppliers out there. We see the same in Canada as well. New Bill of Rights have just come on board as well. There's a lot of movement across the provinces. But more so, just to give you some additional insight into this, as of 2019, 2020, you can see these numbers in terms of website accessibility lawsuits over time. 2013, there were just a mere 2,722. And I want to be very specific. This is what was published by Seyfarth and Shaw. And essentially, over time, into 2019, there were well over 20,000 lawsuits just on the DOJ alone. So, I mean, beyond the DOJ, there's literally tens and tens of thousands of lawsuits that are going on beyond what you're seeing on this little chart that I'm showing here as well. So, don't want to be the shark, as Lainey said, but certainly, these are the types of legal settlements. I'm showing this very small, but, one that stands out is, $20 million right here. And certainly, there are more and more legislation coming into place. We talked about CRPD, which is the Convention for Rights with Peoples with Disabilities under the UN. A lot of countries have ratified this throughout the world, and US has not, but certainly these are reasons why this is sort of a moving wave at this point in time to do the right thing. But I would also say, you should really focus on the fact that this is a whole market that is available. So what do we need to do? And I'm going to throw it over to Scott.
Thanks, Dennis. The most important thing to do is to realize that you need to put together a plan to be inclusive. Lainey laid out some things that are really important. One is a statement, an accessibility statement saying what you're going to do to do the right thing and be in compliance with the laws. I mean, obviously, we want to meet the needs of this large and growing population, and we want to be able to put together a scenario where we can ensure, not only now, but in the future, that um, we're set up to continue to create accessible documents in all formats, automate it as much as possible, and make sure that the scope is wide enough to meet the needs of our disabled customers. Next slide, please. So we spend a lot of time, as you can imagine, talking with organizations that are private organizations or enterprises or governments, and when we discuss accessibility, their responses relative to their plans fall into one of these four buckets or something close to that. So a lot of times, people come to us and say, "Hey, our documents are not compliant with regulations. Can you help us?" We have some folks that say, "Hey, it's way too expensive. We can't deal with the high volume documents."
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I had a couple of comments from people that can't hear you very well.
Okay, is that any better?
Much better, thank you.
Okay. My documents are compliant. I've got a solution. Every once in a while we run into that, but occasionally still, in spite of all the lawsuits and whatnot, we run into, I'm ignoring the issue. We haven't been sued yet. Next slide, Dennis. So documents are a particularly vexing problem for a lot of organizations. They may have invested in remediating their website, but documents are unique. A lot of times they weren't designed with accessibility in mind, particularly if they're archived documents or old documents. So they don't have built-in metadata to make it available to screen readers or assistive technologies to help blind people consume. Some documents are stored as scanned images, which is difficult because it's an image. There's no text to tag. That has to be manually remediated. A lot of times the formatting is poor. Karen McCall did a session earlier today on designing accessible documents, and she had a lot of great information about how to use style sheets and whatnot to make sure that your documents are formatted in such a way that they can be turned into accessible documents pretty easily. The reality is, if you have bad documents to start with, it's going to be difficult to make them accessible, and probably it's going to take time and resources. Next slide, Dennis. So the challenge, if you want to get right down to it, is basically, how do I make all the documents that I need to make accessible? And it's educational things, it's published content. If you're in business, not only do you have to worry about the customer-facing documents, but you also need to remember that the documents that are internal, your employee handbooks, your policies relative to things like accessibility, for example, job applications, all sorts of policies and things like that need to be made in accessible formats as well. Fortunately, a lot of the regulations rely on the same standards. The WCAG 2.0 level AA is sort of the minimum at this point in time. WCAG 2.1, the next revision of that recommendation is going to be coming out, and lawsuits are already starting to manifest based on people that don't meet that standard. One last thing to really be aware of, and it's certainly a challenge, is quality assurance and quality control when you're building accessible documents. You can be compliant with regulations when building an accessible document and have it be totally unusable. There are lots and lots of things that go into making documents usable for those who need to have them in accessible formats. Dennis will talk a little bit more about that later on, but I wanted to emphasize it certainly at this point in time, because it's a legitimate challenge as you're moving down the path to provide accessible documents. Dennis, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. So, without all that information, I guess the critical thing is, you got to get a game plan together. And we've had these conversations earlier today with a number of folks as well. So we talked with Kathy Lovell at Regions Bank, and that was a great example of how to create a culture of inclusion ultimately, right? Around accessibility. They sort of said, you know, we want to service this market out there. So how do we do this type of inclusion? One thing that they did was, and they didn't skimp on, was the fact that they created an inclusion and they put it into their DNA, if you will. So inclusion by design ultimately was the critical note that they actually were able to roll out and implement. It wasn't an afterthought. It wasn't a retrofit. It was something that they were saying, hey, we're going to start from the documents that we build, and we're going to provide this to our clients out there. One thing to note, however, is that, you know, if you do decide to do retrofitting, you know, based on development and so on, it's almost 10 times more than the cost of actually doing it at the beginning. So while some organizations may need to retrofit, we don't generally recommend it. As far as the, you know, critical organizational requirements are concerned, you know, it's good for all. You should be budgeting for accessibility. And one thing that we always talk about is when you create a culture of inclusion, we talk about things like ensuring training is brought to the organization, and that the training is passed along to every individual out there, and why you should think about this as well. As far as success is concerned, and I get the opportunity always to sort of track what happens as part of this whole business. We talk to organizations like the ones in Florida, for example, about creating templates, style sheets, and so on. And as Karen talked about, you know, creating those fonts and using Unicode-based fonts and so on. Incorporating it into templates like in MS Word, PowerPoint, Excel, and so on. Those commonly used pieces of software, and certainly train to use that software throughout, because once you do that, that implementation can go forward. And certainly when we talk about things like your website, the documents that you store in your content management systems and so on, it's very important to ensure that you have a solution. So let's talk a little about the things that you should be implementing ultimately. And I'll throw it over to the next slide here, where we can talk a little bit about, you know, remediation backlogs. Make sure you have a plan that's going to be set up properly. Do a lot of web monitoring, audits, and controls. If you have you know, a diversified website, for example, whereby, you know, or individuals can upload content on WordPress or Joomla or whatever the case may be, make sure you're testing that information on a go-forward basis. Make sure you're doing document monitoring, that you're doing ongoing audits, you're testing them. You're doing the QC and QA as always, and ensure that you're not just using electronic tools to test them, but actually physically testing them. High volume correspondence. You should have a plan, and certainly Crawford Technologies has software solutions that will roll out to do high volume, high speed remediation solutions as well. And one critical thing that a lot of people sort of say is, well, now that I got my accessible PDFs on our websites done, do I still need Braille and large print? Absolutely. You absolutely do. Much like Lainey said, you know, this is not I'm going to build a car at 35% and I'm going to, or at 65%. Or individuals out there that have read Braille all their lives and so on, or large print. That's a preference management thing. Much like, you know, as Matt Swain talked about, there are multiple channels out there in customer communications. Braille is almost like a language. You've grown up with that and you've learned how to use that. And finally, on the back end, make sure that you do your QA, quality assurance, and quality control to ensure that you're not rolling out, you know, or to documents that are poorly tagged or poorly formatted. It's just good business sense to do that. So I'm throwing it back to Scott here.
Thanks, Dennis. There are a lot of things that need to be in your plan if you are going to avoid litigation. Website accessibility is probably the biggest thing. Lainey mentioned a couple of settlements that were related to, you know, web access, and certainly mobile is becoming more and more important. There are a number of gaming software companies that have been sued because their mobile games, their mobile apps were not accessible. Other things to consider: if you're in this session, you may have turned on closed captioning. Video captioning is as important as ever for people who are blind and deaf. including alternate text for maps and for graphics. It's very easy to do that in Microsoft products and some of the other products. So it's really important that we start utilizing and start training people to utilize the accessibility features that are available. Certainly, PDFs on website have been a vexing thing as well. Portals, those need to be accessible as well, particularly if you know, they are where people are retrieving bills and tax forms and things like that. The bottom line is anything retrieved through those needs to be accessible. And again, you know, Dennis had mentioned accommodation earlier. You have to be prepared as an organization if someone asks you for Braille or large print or e-text or audio. Basically, you have to be able to not only comply with the letter of the law and provide electronic formats, but you need to provide the physical accommodation formats as well. Next slide, Dennis. So, diving into the accommodations type of formats a little bit, you need to be prepared to provide them. Okay, so if you're an outsourcer and you're providing documents in accessible formats for your clients, then you probably are going to be under pressure to provide accommodation formats as well. Every large entity that is required by law to send you a statement or a policy or something like that is going to have to be able to provide these documents not only in electronic formats that would support the use of assistive technologies like screen readers and you know, electronically attached braille readers and things like that, but also you're going to have to figure out how to give requesters physical formats. You know, Dennis mentioned preference management a little bit earlier, and we talked about it in some of the other tracks, but the reality is there has to be a way that you provide to enable your disabled customers to establish how they'd like to retrieve documents. There's nothing more frustrating and nothing more terrible in terms of customer experience than having to call up customer service every single month to say, oh, by the way, can I have my bill in Braille, please? In terms of the formats, I mentioned them before in accommodation. You've got the Braille formats. Go ahead, Dennis, to the next slide. You have large print, and large print is not just enlarging something in a copier and blowing it up to 11 by 17. There are specific standards that should be followed, you know, minimum font sizes and things like that, that organizations that are used to doing this can provide on behalf of your state customers that need these types of statements. Go ahead, Dennis. Voice, audio CDs are used many times by people who are blind, partially sighted, or cognitively disabled. If they request that format, you need to provide it to them. The same would apply for e-text as well. You know, everyone thinks of accessible documents. They think of accessible PDF. You know, certainly that's a format that needs to be provided, and it is one of the formats that meets the WCAG 2.0 recommendations. It contains metadata that identifies ways in which the people who are using assistive technologies can actually navigate easily through a document. If you go to the next slide, Dennis, HTML5 is also an accessible format. If people follow semantic HTML5 coding rules, accessible HTML5 is accessible inherently. However, because people have done all sorts of things like using div tags and things like that, that command or combined formatting and things like that, not all HTML5 is formatted properly for accessibility, though it certainly is one of the WCAG recognized formats that you can use to provide information in an accessible format that can be used by assistive technologies. Next slide, Dennis.
So, a little bit about what we need to do next. And while we've been sitting here, I just got a text saying that the NFB has just also gone ahead to sort of say, hey, digital signatures are an important thing as well for folks that have, especially in these current times where COVID's in play, folks that have autoimmune disease or folks that can't get to do inked-based or wet-based signatures become very critical. So we know very much digital signatures are coming up. The awareness of accessibility is going to be critical as we move forward. And certainly as we look at things that are happening today within this age where COVID is sort of keeping us at home, keeping folks that may have an autoimmune disease or inability to get to a final destination whereby they can actually interact with a human being, the next best thing is looking for applications that are highly scalable in nature, that are remote based. And certainly this is where we begin to look at how we can apply technology for easier access. When we talk about that, certainly we've heard all day long about assistive technologies. We've heard about things like JAWS, which is a well-known assistive technology, voice reading software, which essentially allows us to navigate through accessible PDFs and essentially navigate it like a person that is able with eyes would do. Non-visual desktop access, NVDA, another well-known piece of software. There are other tools like refreshable braille displays, Windows eyes, and so on. These are critical in terms of where we're moving into the future. And certainly when we present PDFs out there, a tagged PDF looks basically identical to anybody who's cited. However, they certainly carry all that metadata in the back end of those documents to allow us to essentially use these technologies to ensure that everything is inclusive. So with that, we talk a little bit about our technology and where we're going. Today, the world of accessibility has been dominated by what is called manual remediation. We've got a boatload of people in the background just trying to tag content, very high costs. And if you become one of the best of the best of the best taggers out there, you may get 50 to 100 pages of a book done in a single day. So not very fast, right? So certainly, as we move forward, automation becomes sort of the key focus in this space, where you can do hundreds or even thousands of pages per second to do that type of conversion. And certainly we saw a little bit of that through McKinsey earlier on today with some of the tools through Remediate. And certainly there are a lot of tools out there that we have to also do things like auto tagging, enable it and monetize it by being able to upload it and democratize it essentially at any time that they wish to have a document made accessible. You simply upload the document and a fully composed and fully remediated PDF comes out the back end. So these are some of the critical things that are changing the landscape, and certainly within this time of COVID-19, we want to be sure that we have access to that technology. Now, with access to technology, there are always pitfalls. So I think, Karen did talk about this earlier on, AI tools that are trying to figure out, hey, can I tag this image as two people standing on a mountain, two people rolling down a hill on a mountain, two people falling off a mountain? Really can't be done. So there is still some manual QA and QC as we talked about. So make sure when you build that infrastructure that you have the capability to interrogate these documents and images. Things like complex tables, the heuristic algorithms are getting way better these days. But certainly, these types of tables are there to convey a certain piece of technical piece of data. It doesn't necessarily need to be presented this way. So when you think about how to create that inclusive culture, perhaps a different way of actually outlining how this information should be actually delivered on a document. And that focuses very well in terms of how a document that is inclusive has to be done. There are things like mathematical symbology as well. There are things like read order that are critically important as well that you need to consider. So you need to have the folks that are in your organization trained so that you don't spend a lot of time, setting up read order where I read down this page and I end up on page 60 next. You want to be reading from top to bottom, left to right, which is very traditional. And certainly the other side of things that are falling into some of these areas are around color contrast. You know, it's Christmas all over again in this picture here, but having the right choices and the bad choices are critical. You want to be sure you follow the guidelines as far as contrast is concerned. So there are tests that will ensure that it meets the minimum 4.5 hex value contrast to 1. And certainly as we look forward, there are things like scan text, stuff like this that, you know, there's a lot of archives of information that are stored as far as scanned text that as we learned earlier on, you know, these are not Unicode fonts. This is just an image. And you probably need to convert that content back out again to ensure that this information is interrogatable and you can actually find out that information and content. And finally, you know, we're seeing a lot of this, fillable forms. A lot of websites have fillable forms, you know, your self-service type model out there. Make sure these are accessible. You know, whenever you're trying to reach a website to make a complaint, maybe sign up for voting, maybe, you know, order something along the way. Those fillable forms, whether they be PDF or HTML-based, web-based solutions, they should be made completely accessible. With that, I'm going to throw it back to Scott, who's going to talk a little bit more about the transactional side of things.
Transactional documents provide a real challenge for a lot of organizations because many times they are also high volume documents. We have banking customers, for example, that are creating, you know, 400 to 500 million pages of bills and statements on a monthly basis. One of the nice things about those types of documents is that they are very regular in format. Pretty much everyone's bank statement looks very, very, very similar. Clearly the content is highly variable, but at least in terms of the style of the document, they're similar enough that you can actually very, very easily create templates that represent the tagging rules, so you can actually automate doing high volume documents or doing transactional style documents. Next slide, please, Dennis. So this is an example of how we would use a tool that we call Designer to create the templates that would dictate how the document would be tagged in an automated fashion. And when I say in an automated fashion, I really mean at scale. Once we've built templates, once the templates have been tested, we have the ability to start with print-ready files that normally would go to a high-volume print and mail operation. We direct it through our software, and we can create hundreds of thousands of pages per second in terms of creating accessible documents. Clearly, it has an impact on how quickly you can turn around a document, particularly when you compare it to formerly manual processes. So this is one avenue that we would use to automate dealing with high volume documents. If you go to the next slide, Dennis. Again, we want to talk a little bit about testing and quality assurance. You need to test your documents, and you can use automatic tools all you want, but somebody needs to actually physically test that you've been successful in creating an accessible experience. Right now, Conduit, who is formerly a division of Xerox, is being sued by the state of California Parks because they were hired to create an accessible website. It was a multiple year type of contract and process. They turned it over, and they found out, unfortunately, that the website was not accessible despite their claim that it was. That's still under litigation at this point in time. There are tons of tools that you can use to help out. There's electronic testing tools like PAC3. Certainly, a lot of people use Adobe Acrobat Pro to ensure that you know, things are tagged properly. But nothing really replaces physical user testing. As Dennis pointed out, there are lots and lots of pitfalls that automation can't deal with relative to testing. And there's a huge difference between a document that is compliant with accessibility regulations and one that's usable by end users. Next slide, please, Dennis. Dennis, are you still with us? There we go. We actually have built a platform. We call it Accessibility Now, that is designed to be able to provide the tools and technologies in combination that would enable you to automate the creation of accessible documents, regardless of whether they are static or transactional style documents. If you'll advance to the next tab, Dennis.
Yep.
All right, so I've discussed transactional documents. Everything else is static documents. So that would be ad hoc correspondence, that would be newsletters, that would be marketing brochures, plan benefit summaries, all sorts of documents that are not regular in formatting. The challenge is, how do I provide an automated solution that enables me to provide any of the required formats that people might ask for, be they electronic like PDF or accessible HTML5 or the other physical accommodation formats. If you hit the tab down, the platform is comprehensive, providing services and tools like Remediate, the ability to scan sites and validate whether or not documents are accessible or not, depending on what you're trying to accomplish. The goal is to help you achieve your accessibility goals. Go ahead and press one more time, Dennis. Obviously, you would like to comply with the regulations, particularly if you're in North America, the AOTA and the ADA laws here in the United States, as well as Section 508. You want to be able to mitigate your risks of being presented with a demand letter and getting involved in a lawsuit. Certainly, that's the right thing to do, and you want to meet your customers' accessibility needs, particularly since this is a large population. According to the World Health Organization, right now, over 1.3 billion people are sight challenged globally today. And go ahead one more time, Dennis. The platform is also designed to be able to get you there in a timely fashion and in an automated fashion. So I'm going to end with this little snapshot of Crawford Technologies. In addition to providing accessibility software and services, we also provide solutions and platforms that are tailored for the enterprise output and content services industries. Basically, we're here to help customers communicate better with their customers, regardless of whether it's through their normal transaction document workflows or accessibility. And I think with that, Dennis, we are done and ready for questions, are we not?
We are.
Okay, we do have a couple of minutes, and I do see that a couple of questions came in. So the first one is, you mentioned Florida litigation. Can you reiterate what areas did the cities, towns, and counties get judicial action on?
Yeah, it's interesting. That's a good question because typically most of the litigation has been around web side of things. But with the sunshine lines in Florida, that meant access to all information was possible as far as things like county minutes, budgets, and so on. As a result, it was a lot of their PDF documents that they had hosted on all their websites. And what ultimately happened with most of the counties and municipalities, with the exception of a few, they all settled. And the reason why they settled was if they took it to court, they were worried about a larger class action lawsuit that was going to occur. Ultimately, each of the counties averaged about 20,000 plus as far as the settlements were concerned, with strict orders to do remediation and so on. But The ones that have decided to fight it, they're still in court at this point in time, but it certainly was all document-based. So we're talking about mainly PDFs, Word documents, as well as PowerPoint type presentations and so on.
Great, thank you. I see one more question. You talked about VPATs. Oh, sorry, that was from another. Do I need to provide alternate formats?
Yeah, and I think that's a really good question. You know, if you've spent your entire life reading Braille, and I use the example of an 82-year-old grandmother who's read Braille all her life, you know, she probably isn't going to go ahead and potentially get a laptop and potentially put JAWS on it and learn how to use that. This is beyond preference management. It's like a language. It's the format that they are used to. So you certainly, if there is a request, and it's a reasonable request, and that's what the ADA says, is that reasonable accommodation is all part of this. You should be able to provide a document in Braille for that individual. Remember, this is essentially a civil right, and it is covered under the laws. And so whenever you've done all your digital assets, make sure you have a facility and a capability of doing something like physical large print, physical audio, or for that matter, Braille, whether it be in you know, grade 1 or grade 2 Braille.
Yeah, I think Lainey made a really, really good point in her presentation when she suggested that people have a way of dealing with one-offs. And many times a request for a document in an alternate format might be a one-off, or might be something that you only do on a sporadic basis, and that's where